Okay, so here's your solution for the population change problem. I know this problem caused a lot of stress and concern, but it should have been a relatively easy problem. Let's walk through it, and perhaps you can see how it could be done relatively simply. So, Statistics Canada has reported the following information about Canada's population. We have the birth, death, immigration, and emigrants for 1961 up to 1966 and 1996 to 2001. The questions that we need to answer are down at the bottom. So my first step is to find the important information, and the important information would most certainly be what is included here in the table and the questions down at the bottom. And what I know is that there are two time periods. I know how many people were born, died, moved in, which is immigrated, and left the country, emigrated. I need to find out during which time period the population changed the most. I need to find out whether it went up or down for each time period. And I need to find out for each time period if immigration and emigration changed the population more or less than birth and death rate. So to do this, I'm going to try and save some time. Now that I've looked at all the questions and I know what I have to find, I'm going to try and do my math in an order that will allow me to get all of the answers by doing the math only once. So I know that I'm going to need the birth and death rate separate from the immigration and emigration statistics. I know I'm going to need that for the third question, so I'm going to try and find that right from the beginning. In order to do that, I'm going to compare or add the birth and death rate as well as the immigration and emigration for each of the time periods. So let's actually do that math. So during 1961 to 1966, we had 224,900 births, and I'm going to take away from that, or to be technically accurate, I'm going to add a decrease of 731,000 deaths. And if I compare those or put those together, I will have a total of minus 506,100. So the population has decreased by 506,100 people because there were more deaths than there were births. For immigration and emigration, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take the number of immigrants and I'm going to make that a positive number. And I'm going to compare that to the decrease or the negative number of immigrants, and there I will have an increase, which means more people moved in than moved out, of 259,000. If I put those two together, overall, from 1961 to 1966, the population has decreased by 247,100 people. And I did that by comparing positive 259,000 to negative 506,100. So I compared those two, I added those two together, and it makes sense that it's a negative number because this is a negative number and it's the bigger one. It's bigger by 247,100, which logically makes sense when I look at the two numbers. So let's do the same thing for 1996 to 2001. The mathematics here is basically a repeat, so if you had trouble following it the first time, perhaps it'll make more sense this time. I'm going to take the birth rate, which is much bigger, and I'm going to compare that to the death rate, which should be negative. And my total there will be 609,000. And that makes sense because, again, I can see the birth rate is bigger than the death rate, so it should be a positive number. For immigration and emigration, and really I should have used brackets up here. Again, emigration should be a negative number. And the total, 1,390,000. More, again, the immigration is higher than the emigration. And if I compare these two numbers, since they're both positive, I know my answer will be positive. Oops, I've made a mistake. This number should actually have been 781,000. And when I do my double check, I would have seen that. The overall, when I add those two numbers together, again, they're still both positive, should be 1,390,000. So the overall here is a positive number, so it's increased by 1,390,000. And here it has decreased by 247,100. I can very quickly see that there is a much bigger population change because it's a bigger number from 1996 to 2001. I can also very quickly see that from 1961 to 1966, the population went down, and from 1996 to 2001, the population went up. So let's put these into final answers. Question 1. The population changed much more during 1996 to 2001 because there was an increase of 1,390,000, which is much more than a decrease of 247,100. In fact, and I did a little bit of extra math here, I compared those two numbers, and by subtracting one from the other, I also got how big of a change. This sort of work is what would move you towards an A+. For question 2, from 1961 to 1966, the population decreased by 247,100. Decrease tells me it shrank, it went down. And I know that that number is a decrease because when I did the math, it was a negative number. And from 1996 to 2001, it increased by 1,390,000. That was a positive number, so it increased. For question 3, because of the way I did the math the first time, I immediately know that the population was more influenced by birth and death from 1961 to 1966, and from 1996 to 2001, immigration and emigration had a bigger effect. I know that because if I move back, I'll see that the numbers were bigger for the birth and death rate in 1961 and 1966 than the immigration and emigration. And in 1996 to 2001, the difference was the opposite. The math is on the previous page. So how could I justify this? There are so few calculations here that justifying is actually a little bit difficult. One possible way to justify would be to do a little bit of estimating. I rounded all of the numbers, and you can see what I've rounded the numbers to here. I went to the nearest 25,000. So I rounded births to 225,000, deaths to 750,000. Comparing those two numbers, very quickly I know Deaths is bigger, so it should be a negative number. Indeed it is. And if I estimate that math I can do in my head, I would estimate that the difference would be about 525,000. And in fact, if you go back to the actual math, the difference was 506,100. Very close. The immigration and emigration, I rounded to 550,000, and the emigration to 275,000. Again, I can quickly see that immigration is a higher number, so it should turn out to be positive. And if I quickly do the math, it should be positive by about 275,000. The actual number was 259,000. And if I compare those two numbers, negative 525,000 to positive 275,000, they are separate from each other by about 250,000. So we're looking at more of a population change, a decline, because of the births and deaths. And from 1996 to 2001, you can see the numbers that I've rounded there. In fact, very quickly, I could look at the deaths and the immigrants and see that those two numbers are about canceling each other out. By rounding, they both round to 1 million. So in fact, I really only have to compare the births and the emigrants, and I can see very rapidly that 1,750,000 births is far more than 275,000 people leaving. Different by 1,500,000, which again you can see down here at the bottom. We're looking at that kind of population change, dramatically different than what we had in 1961 to 1966. So my justification is just doing a little bit of rounding, a little bit of estimating. You also might have chosen to do some reverse operations. Hopefully this has been helpful, and you can see that it didn't have to be a complicated question, just a little bit of math there at the beginning, and especially if you organize things nicely, the math can all be done for you and you just have to answer the questions.